Hi, I'm going to show you how to sew the shawl collar of the Whistler. So this is our pattern piece right here, and you can see that one side has a shape and then the other side is pretty straight. And then the ends are different as well. We have, this is the bottom and then this top edge right here. So you're going to have 4 pieces like this, 2 sets. So to begin with, we're going to sew this end together to create the one piece of the collar. So just right sides together and then sew it with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So I do prefer to sew this seam with a sewing machine rather than a serger, and I'll show you why in just a second here. Keep your pieces together nicely. So just like that. So this is some pretty thick French or sweatshirt fabric, so even though my thread is contrasting, it's kind of hidden, so I do apologize for that. But I like to sew it versus serging so that I can open the seam up when I press it, and that helps reduce the bulk. Also, you'll see here that it's clipped into the seam allowance at that notch. So we have this notch right here. Just go ahead and take your scissors and clip into that to open that up. You see how that opens? And what that does is it allows the collar to take shape better versus sewing that and then having that bulk there. It doesn't open up. So like I said, you're welcome to serge it, but I do find that the collar lays nicer and there's less bulk if you sew it with a regular sewing machine and then clip that seam open and then press your seam allowance open. So this one has been pressed. You can see how it will lay open nicely, and then it allows, you can already see how the collar is kind of wanting to take shape because of the shape of the end right there. So now we have 2 sets of these, and we're going to place them right sides together, and then we're going to sew along the outside edge. So I'm going to grab some clips here real fast and just clip these together. So we're going to match up these seams, and they're open. You can see how that I kept them open to reduce that bulk there, especially if you're using a bulkier fabric like this sweatshirt fabric. You definitely want to reduce the bulk of that seam as much as possible. So just clip or pin in place as needed. If you're using a sweater fabric, make sure that you're not stretching this seam out. It might be helpful to even stay stitch that seam or serge it before piecing these together if your fabric really frays a lot and is threatening to unravel on you. It's okay to serge that before you sew. So here you can see we have our shaped edge and then we have our straight edge. We are sewing along this shaped edge right there. That's the front of our shawl collar. And again, you can sew this with the serger or the sewing machine. I'm just moving my pin. So these pins mark that star and circle markings on the pattern. I'm going to move this the other direction. We'll need those in a little bit. So, but I don't want to move my pins. So I'm just going to being careful so I don't sew over that pin. am stopping and pivoting where the pattern is shaped just to get a nice clean edge there. Nice clean shape. Just making sure my fabrics are together nicely. Okay. I'm at this bulky seam, so I'm making sure that my seam allowances are pressed open and everything's going the right direction for me. Just going to continue down this other side. And again, I'm maintaining that 3/8 inch seam allowance for the entire seam. So there we go. Again, even though it's contrasting thread, that thick fabric's hiding it a little bit. So again, I'm going to clip in these corners. You don't want to clip so far that you clip your seam. So you're just clipping it a little bit. What that does is it releases the fabric on those turns so that when we press, or we turn this right side out, our fabric goes where we want it to go. So now we're just going to take this, we sewed it right side together. Now we're just flipping it along that seam that we just sewed to bring it wrong sides together. And again, making sure my seam allowance is open where we sewed the two pieces together. And I'm just running my hand in here to create that curve so that everything lays nicely. Okay. So there we have that. And repeating on the other side. So you definitely want to take the time to press this seam that we're turning this on to make sure that everything stays nice and crisp, and it's a lot easier to maintain. So there, we've turned it so that our collar pieces are now wrong sides together, and you can see my markings on both ends. So I used pins to mark. I've got one marked on front and one on back. So I'm just going to switch that up a little bit there. Change that to the other side. So these pins are marking those star and circle pieces. So now, if you want, you can definitely top stitch this edge to keep it in place, or you can keep it as is. So I'm going to pause the video here and go press this seam, and I'll be back in just a moment. So we're back, and I have pressed and top stitched this curved shaped edge of our collar, and now it's time to line up the bottoms before we sew the collar to the front of our shirt. So this seam that we have sewn, that's the inside of our collar. So I'm going to turn it towards the inside so that we have the raw edge on the outside. And now we're going to line up these marks that we have made. These are the circle and the star markings from our pattern pieces. We're just going to line them up like such. And as you can see, there's a little bit of overhang on both sides. So that's what we want. We're not lining these up right on top of each other. this is wrong. See how our marks don't line up? So they're slightly offset. And then to double check that everything lines up correctly before I baste this in place, I bring my front piece here. And this one's going to be kind of hard to see. So these are our pockets. This is that center front. And I kind of line them up with that as well. And so it looks like the bulkiness of my fabric might have affected how wide my pieces are, because it's getting eaten up in its seam allowance because of how thick they are. So when I line this up like this, it's not quite lining up as well as I would like it to with that end. Can you see there how it's a little bit short? So I'm going to go ahead and adjust it so that it lines up. So I want the width of this, of the bottom of the collar, to match that. So about right there works better. And it's the bulk of my fabric that's done it. Sometimes you have to make a little bit of adjustments like that. If you're using a regular mid-weight fabric, it's probably lining up just fine, but basically you want this bottom of your shawl collar to line up with the top of this center front piece. Okay, so then I'm just double checking that our collar is all assembled correctly, and now we're going to baste this front together. So I'm removing these pins. They've done their job. They were just to mark those pieces for me, and I just baste these together. So a basting stitch is just a long temporary stitch. We use a long stitch because it's easier to remove if needed, quicker to sew, and it's just a temporary stitch that holds your pieces together to make constructing easier. So now we have our collar, we have our front. We're going to take the collar and the front, right sides together, kind of flip them together like this, line them up along that edge, and see how they line up nicely. And now we're going to sew that edge together. So again, with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, just sew that together. I do recommend that you backstitch at the beginning and end, and I do recommend that you sew this with a regular sewing machine and not a serger. There are so many layers that your serger is very likely to push things around and just not line them up properly. If you want this to be a clean edge, I would recommend that you serge those prior to assembling this piece. So there you can see how our shawl collar has taken shape. If you see that there's a little bit of shaping to that seam right there, that's where we've clipped the seam allowance, because that's going to fold down like that. And you can kind of see how our shawl collar is formed. Now, there are buttons and buttonholes here. I skipped that because I prefer to sew those on after I'm all done and make sure that there's no chunky buttons in my way or anything like that. So you can definitely do it earlier in the instructions like it states, but I prefer to wait and do that at the end. You do not need a functioning buttonhole here, but you certainly can do it. So I'll link to another video for sewing a buttonhole for those that need it, but I'm just going to be sewing my button directly through all of these layers when I get to that step. So this neckline is plenty big enough to slip this on and off without opening those buttons up. So we would press this seam down here towards the body of the shirt, and that's it. That's how you assemble the shawl collar of the Whistler.